Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we continue our series on the growth and fracturing of New England. Today we continue discussing the Massachusetts Bay Colony and increased tensions occurring within the colony in today's episode. We last left off in May of 1634 when John Winthrop was voted out as governor, and he was replaced by his political rival Thomas Dudley. In a May 22nd letter to Nathaniel Rich, Winthrop says a census of the colony had not been taken, nor was one planned. However, he estimated that there were approximately 4,000 people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 6 years, the colony had exploded by more than any other colony we've seen up to this point, and it shows just how bad the situation was in England in terms of the religious tensions. Winthrop makes a notable observation about government. Let's have a look at the writing. Our civil government is mixed. The free men choose magistrates every year, and 4 courts in the year, 3 out of each town, there being 8 in all, do assist the magistrates in making of laws, imposing taxes, and disposing of lands. Our furies are chosen by the freemen of every town. Our churches are governed by pastors, teachers, ruling elders, and deacons, yet the power lies in the whole congregation. Winthrop in his writings acknowledges the existence of Maryland in June of 1634, something that we've talked about in prior broadcasts. On July 9th, William Bradford and Edward Winslow come to Boston and visit John Winthrop along with 2 others. There's no mention of them visiting Thomas Dudley. Also, the governor of the Plymouth colony at the time, Thomas Prince, was not present, but it kind of shows this relationship, and it would continue for some years between William Bradford and John Winthrop. Winthrop mentions some tensions between the parties, and this was because there was a conflict between traders of Massachusetts Bay and traders of Plymouth up in Maine earlier that year, and somebody was actually killed. Plymouth had a trading post on the Kennebec River led by a John Howland. Massachusetts Bay had a trading post led by John Hocking. Howland asserted that Hocking had no right to be there. The situation escalated until an armed conflict led John Hocking to kill one of John Howland's men. Hocking himself was killed in a retaliatory attack. One of the Plymouth traders was arrested and jailed in Boston. In this meeting, Plymouth claimed that Hocking was killed because he was about to shoot other men, essentially a self-defense claim. Plymouth did acknowledge that they were a little hasty and did not do everything possible to preserve the man's life, and that they would be more careful in dealings like this in the future. The meeting seems to have diffused the situation. At the same time, former Governor Matthew Craddock, we remember him from long ago, he was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay. He's back in England and writes to John Winthrop demanding that the patent for the colony be returned. An answer was returned to Craddock that the matter could only be decided by the General Court. At the end of August, Massachusetts Bay welcomed the first trade offer from Maryland. The General Court met in September, and the biggest issue debated was the migration of Thomas Hooker and others from Newtown, which we now know as Cambridge, to Connecticut. The pros and cons were weighed in that General Court, and the vote came out 15-10 in favor of allowing the migration. Winthrop notes that this debate and vote divided Governor Dudley and his deputies and assistants. So Dudley was at odds with some of his own people over whether or not to allow this. This general court session also passed laws against the use of tobacco. Now remember, Puritan society was different than other societies in England or the southern colonies for that matter. So now tobacco usage was going to be far less in New England than it was going to be in the other parts of the colonies. At the same time, the Pequot, which was a tribe over in the Connecticut area, sent a delegation to the colonies on November 6th. It was their second delegation in just a few weeks. The Pequot wanted friendship, however, let's take a look at the writing, that they were willing to have friendship, but because they had killed some Englishmen, Captain Stone, they must first deliver up those who were guilty of his death. They answered that the sachem who then lived was slain by the Dutch, and all the men who were guilty were dead of the pox, except 2, and that if they were worthy of death, they would move their sachem to have them delivered. So there's a lot to unpack here. We had talked about in previous episodes that the Pequot natives, along with some early English colonists and the Dutch just to the west, were beginning to kind of crowd that area, and it was getting problematic. A Captain Stone had been killed by the Pequot natives. The English wanted revenge, and this had been many months later, and now the Pequots are saying, everybody's dead except for these 2 people, but if you want them, we could try to get them moved out here. They wanted friendship, the Pequots did, because they were at war with the Narragansett natives, and they were at war with the Dutch, as we saw in the last writing there. So they were in need of friends, and they were getting pressed basically out of their area. They agreed to bring 2 surviving men responsible for the death of Captain Stone, and they were agreeable to allowing the English to colonize Connecticut. The next day, word came that 200 to 300 Narragansett natives were coming to Boston to attack the Pequot delegation. This is a little scary here. The colony called men to arms, only to be met by a small delegation seeking peace. And one's got to wonder if the game of telephone may have inflamed that situation up beyond what it actually was. Both the Pequot and the Narragansett would leave the colony with peace agreements in place. In April, the colony confronted the teachings of Roger Williams. Let's have a look. The occasion was for that he had taught publicly that a magistrate ought not to tender an oath to an unregenerate man, for that we thereby have communion with a wicked man in the worship of God, and cause him to take the name of God in vain. He was heard before all the ministers and very clearly confuted. So Roger Williams beginning to fall out with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By May of 1535, when the General Court met to re-elect the governor, Dudley had not been mentioned by Winthrop, and the court seemed ready for a change. The court elected John Haynes as the new governor of the colony, and not much happened for a couple of months. On September 8th, Roger Williams was summoned before the General Court and questioned about his teachings. He is told that if he should persist in teaching certain beliefs that the court did not agree with, he would be punished. In October, John Winthrop the Younger, that's John Winthrop's son, arrived with his commission to start a colony at Saybrook, he being the colony's first governor. Saybrook is in what would today be southern Connecticut. At the same time, Roger Williams was brought before the court again regarding his teachings. He opted to dispute his position, and the court determined that Williams needed to leave the colony within 6 weeks. This is very similar to the John Lyford, John Oldham situation that we saw in Plymouth several weeks ago. So Roger Williams is basically banished from Massachusetts Bay with 6 weeks to leave. The core of Williams' belief structure is that individuals should not be punished by the state for sins against the church. In January, opinion about Williams worsened and further actions were considered. Let's have a look at what Winthrop has to say. He, governor, and assistants met at Boston to consider about Mr. Williams, for that they were credibly informed that notwithstanding the injunction laid upon him not to go about to draw others in his opinions, he did use to entertain company in his house and to preach to them, even of such points as he had been censured for, and it was agreed to send him into England by a ship when ready to depart. The reason was because he had drawn above 20 persons to his opinion, and they were intended to erect a plantation about the Narragansett Bay, from whence the infection would easily spread into these churches. So the concern is that Williams is planning to gather a group of people to start a new colony in the Narragansett Bay, which is modern-day Rhode Island. And essentially the growth of that church or movement would infect other areas of New England. So it was decided that Williams would be arrested and sent back to England to face charges. Williams escaped 3 days before authorities arrived to arrest him and send him back to England. And keep in mind, this is in the middle of January, so it's not quite pleasant in terms of weather in New England. But Williams escapes and he's gone, and we're going to talk more about him in a future episode. The spring of 1636 revealed a corn shortage that concerned the colonists greatly. Fortunately, a ship full of potatoes showed up in April, and the colony purchased them for 2 shillings 8 pence per bushel, about 40% less than the price of corn. In May, Williams may have been gone, that's Roger Williams, but his presence still lingered. Let's have a look at the writing. The Church of Salem was still infected with Mr. Williams, his opinions, so as most of them held it unlawful to hear in the ordinary assemblies in England because their foundation was anti-Christian. So basically, and again, these are not totally complete sentences, they're the notes of Winthrop, but Roger Williams' beliefs still lingered far after his escape, and many in the Church of Salem were excommunicated because of this. In May of that year, at the General Court, a new governor is appointed, and it is 23-year-old Henry Vane. John Winthrop and Thomas Dudley, former political rivals but turned friends, were named magistrates. Winthrop described why this happened. Let's have a look. Henry Vane, Esquire, before mentioned, was chosen governor, and because he was son and heir to a privy councillor in England, the ships congratulated his election with a volley of great shot. So Henry Vane was well connected, and that's what led the colonists to elect a 23-year-old as their new governor. On May 31st, Winthrop noted that Thomas Hooker and most of his congregation left Newtown and moved to Connecticut. Massachusetts Bay is starting to become a jumping off point for these other colonies. But before we talk about those new colonies, a war would erupt. And we'll discuss that war more in detail next time on Historical Context.